What if the reason no one takes you seriously isn't because you lack skill, confidence, or intelligence, but because, in ways you don't even notice, you've trained the world to ignore you, not intentionally, not consciously, but consistently? Think about it. You walk into a room, people are talking, laughing, moving with energy. You try to engage, add something, say something, contribute. You speak, but it doesn't land. You joke, but it fades quickly. You explain yourself, but no one really listens. And then there's someone else. He doesn't speak much. He doesn't try to impress. He doesn't chase reactions. Yet somehow, people notice him. When he talks, others pause. When he looks, others adjust. His presence carries weight without effort. Same environment, same opportunity, different outcome. Why? Because the world doesn't respond to effort. It responds to energy, and most people are leaking it. They speak too quickly, react too emotionally, explain too much, give too much, care to visibly, and in doing so, they reveal something dangerous: the need to be liked, the need to be understood, the need to be accepted. And here's the truth: most people will never admit need repels respect, because the moment people feel that you need something from them, their perception of you changes, not consciously, but instinctively. Your value drops, your presence weakens, your words lose weight, and slowly, quietly, you become background noise. This is how most men disappear, not physically, but psychologically. They exist, but they are not felt. They speak, but they are not heard. They try, but they are not respected, not because they are weak, but because they never learned control of their emotions, control of their attention, control of their reactions. Instead, they were taught the opposite: be nice, be available, be expressive, be agreeable. And it sounds good until you realize what it creates. A man who cannot say no, a man who over-explains, a man who reacts instantly, a man who gives more than he receives, a man who is easy to ignore. Because when you are always accessible, you are rarely valued. When you are always expressive, you are easily predictable. When you are always reacting, you are easily controlled. And control is the foundation of power. There's a version of you that you've never met, a version that doesn't rush to speak, doesn't feel the need to prove, doesn't react to everything, a version that observes more than it expresses, chooses more than it chases, thinks more than it feels. That version is not loud, but it is powerful. And the reason it never emerged is because it was buried under habits of seeking validation, habits of avoiding discomfort, habits of prioritizing others over yourself. You didn't lose your power. You gave it away slowly, subtly, repeatedly. But here's the part most people never realize. If you train the world to ignore you, you can train it to respect you, not by forcing dominance, not by pretending confidence, but by mastering something far more rare: yourself. Because the moment you stop reacting automatically, people start observing you differently. The moment you stop over-explaining, your words gain weight. The moment you stop chasing attention, attention begins to follow you. This is not about becoming someone else. It's about removing everything that made you forget who you are, because respect is not something you ask for. It's something you embody. And once you understand that, everything changes. The way you speak, the way you move, the way people respond to you, because the world has always been watching you. The only question is, what have you been showing it? You've been told your entire life that if you want to matter, you need to be visible, speak up, stand out, show yourself. And at first, it makes sense. The loudest voices seem to get attention. The most active people seem to get noticed. The ones who constantly express themselves appear confident, relevant, important. But look closer. Attention is not the same as respect. And this is where most people make a critical mistake. They chase visibility, thinking it will lead to value. So they talk more, post more, react more, explain more. They fill every silence because silence feels uncomfortable. It feels like invisibility. It feels like losing presence. But what they don't realize is this: the more you try to be seen, the less impactful your presence becomes. Because constant visibility creates familiarity, and familiarity, when uncontrolled, creates dismissal. Think about it. When someone is always talking, always available, always reacting, you stop paying close attention, not because they lack intelligence, but because they've removed all tension. There's nothing left to anticipate. Nothing left to wonder about. Nothing left to discover. Without curiosity, attention fades. This is why people who say less often mean more, not because their words are magically better, but because they are rare. Scarcity creates value. When you speak selectively, people listen carefully. When you respond slowly, people pay attention. When you're not always available, your presence feels intentional. But when you are everywhere, all the time, you become background noise. And this doesn't just apply to conversations. It applies to how you show up in life. Always agreeing, always explaining yourself, always proving your point. It feels like effort. But to others, it feels like insecurity, because confidence does not rush to be understood. It does not force itself into every moment. It does not need constant validation. Confidence is comfortable with silence. This is the illusion. You think being seen requires more expression, but real presence is built on restraint. It's knowing when to step forward and when to step back. It's allowing silence to create tension instead of rushing to fill it, because in that silence, something powerful happens. People begin to notice you not because you demanded attention, but because you created space for it. And slowly, the dynamic shifts. You're no longer trying to be seen. You become someone people look for, someone they listen to, someone they can't easily ignore. Not because you did more, but because you learned to do less with intention. Most men don't lose respect because they are weak. They lose it because they were trained to abandon themselves. It starts early. You're taught to be polite, to be agreeable, to avoid conflict, to keep others comfortable even at your own expense. And at first, it feels right. You become the reliable one, the helpful one, the one people can count on. But slowly, something shifts. You start saying yes when you want to say no. You start giving time you don't have. You start tolerating behavior that doesn't sit right with you. And you convince yourself it's the right thing to do. But beneath that, something builds: frustration, resentment, exhaustion. Because deep down, you know the truth. You are giving more than you are receiving, yet nothing changes. Why? Because people don't just listen to what you say. They watch what you accept. Every time you ignore your own needs, you send a message: my time is not that valuable. My boundaries are flexible. My comfort comes second. And people adjust accordingly, not because they're bad, but because you've shown them what's allowed. This is the harsh reality most avoid. You are not just being treated a certain way, you are being responded to. Your behavior teaches people how to treat you. Imagine two men. One is always available, always agreeable, always accommodating. He avoids tension, avoids saying no, avoids standing firm. He believes this makes him likable. But over time, he becomes predictable, easy to rely on, easy to ignore, easy to overlook. The second man is different. He's calm, but firm, respectful, but clear. He doesn't overextend himself. He doesn't rush to please. When something doesn't align with him, he simply steps back. No drama, no over-explanation, no apology for having standards. And suddenly, people treat him differently. They think before asking him for favors. They respect his time. They don't push his boundaries easily. Why? Because he prioritizes himself, not loudly, not aggressively, but consistently. And consistency builds identity. Here's what most people misunderstand: prioritizing yourself is not selfish. It is necessary, because if you don't value your own time, others won't either. If you don't respect your own limits, others will test them. If you don't protect your energy, it will be drained by those who don't think twice. Self-priority is not about rejecting people. It's about choosing yourself first, so that when you give, it comes from strength, not obligation. Because a man who constantly sacrifices himself doesn't become respected, he becomes expected. And expectations, without boundaries, lead to exploitation. The moment you begin to shift this quietly, firmly, everything changes. You don't say yes instantly. You don't explain yourself unnecessarily. You don't tolerate what drains you, and people feel it. At first, they may resist. They may question the change, but over time, they adjust. Because now, you're not just present, you're intentional, and intention commands respect. The truth is simple. The way you treat yourself is the standard others will follow. And the moment you raise that standard, your entire world begins to shift. Most people think power is something you show. In reality, it's something you contain, because the fastest way to lose control in any situation is to lose control of yourself. Think about how easily emotions take over. A small comment triggers irritation. A disagreement turns into anger. A moment of pressure creates anxiety, and before you even realize it, you react. Your tone changes. Your body shifts. Your words come out faster, sharper, less controlled. In that moment, it feels natural. But from the outside, it reveals everything. It shows where you're sensitive, where you're insecure, where you can be influenced. Because emotions, when unmanaged, make you predictable, and predictability is a weakness. If someone knows what will trigger you, they know how to control you. They don't need force. They don't need power. They just need to press the right button. This is why emotional control is not just discipline. It is protection. Now imagine a different scenario. Two people face the same situation. An insult, a challenge, a moment of tension. The first reacts instantly. He defends himself, raises his voice, tries to prove a point. He feels justified, but in doing so, he gives away control. The second does nothing, at least nothing visible. He listens. He pauses. He observes. No immediate reaction, no emotional spike, no urgency to respond, and suddenly the entire dynamic shifts because now the other person is uncertain. They expected a reaction. They prepared for resistance. But instead, they face silence, and silence creates pressure. It forces them to think, to question, to adjust. This is the silent advantage. When you don't react the way people expect, you disrupt their control because most interactions are built on patterns. Say something get a reaction. Push a button gives trigger emotion. But when the reaction doesn't come, the pattern breaks. And in that moment, you gain power. This doesn't mean you never respond. It means you choose when to respond. You delay reaction long enough to think clearly. You separate emotion from action. You ask yourself one simple question. What is the best response, not the fastest one? That pause is everything, because in that pause, you move from being controlled to being in control. Emotional restraint is often misunderstood. People think it means suppression, bottling things up, pretending not to feel. But that's not control. That's avoidance. True control means you feel everything, but you decide what to express. You don't let emotion dictate your behavior. You let intention guide it. And over time, something powerful happens. People stop trying to provoke you. They stop expecting reactions. They stop seeing you as easy to influence because you become stable. Unshaken. Difficult to read. And that creates a different kind of presence. One that doesn't rely on force, but on control, because the strongest person in any room is not the loudest. It's the one who cannot be easily moved. The one who feels everything, but reveals only what is necessary. And in a world driven by reaction, that kind of control is rare, and anything rare becomes powerful. Most people believe influence comes from speaking well, but real influence often comes from something far quieter, seeing clearly. Because while others are focused on being heard, very few are focused on understanding. Watch closely in any conversation. One person is talking, explaining, sharing, reacting in real time. They reveal opinions, emotions, intentions. They try to connect by expressing more. The other person simply listens, not passively, but intentionally. They notice the pauses, the tone behind the words, the small shifts in behavior, and in that silence, they gather something far more valuable than attention. They gather information. Because people reveal themselves constantly, not just through what they say, but how they say it. Confidence can be forced, but patterns cannot be hidden for long. Someone who interrupts often reveals impatience or insecurity. Someone who over-explains reveals a need to be validated. Someone who talks too much often reveals more than they intend. But you only see this when you're not busy talking yourself. Observation requires restraint. It requires you to resist the urge to fill every silence, to prove your point, to be understood immediately, and that's where most people fail. They speak too early, react too quickly, reveal too much. And in doing so, they lose the advantage. Because the moment you expose your thoughts without understanding the other person, you place yourself in a weaker position. Now imagine the opposite. You listen more than you speak. You observe more than you react. You allow others to reveal themselves first. By the time you respond, you already understand the situation, their intentions, their weaknesses, their patterns. And that changes everything. Because now your words are not guesses. They are precise. You don't react emotionally. You respond strategically. Observation turns silence into leverage. It allows you to move with awareness instead of assumption. And awareness is what separates those who are controlled from those who quietly control the situation. You don't need to dominate conversations to gain influence. You need to understand them, because the less you reveal and the more you see, the more powerful your presence becomes. Not loud, not obvious, but effective. And in most cases, that's all that matters. There is a kind of confidence that people perform and a kind that people feel. The first is loud. It tries to prove itself. It seeks reactions. The second is quiet, and it doesn't ask for anything. Most people spend years trying to appear confident. They adjust their tone, their posture, their words. They try to look the part, but underneath that effort, there's still doubt, still a need to be approved, still a need to be accepted. And people sense that immediately, because real authority is not built on appearance. It's built on alignment. Alignment between what you believe and how you act. Internal authority begins the moment you stop asking the world who you should be and start deciding it for yourself. It sounds simple, but it requires something most people avoid. Honesty. Do you respect your own time, or do you give it away easily? Do you respect your own boundaries, or do you ignore them to avoid discomfort? Do you respect your own standards, or do you lower them to fit in? Every time you betray yourself in small ways, you weaken your internal position. And slowly, that weakness becomes visible, not through words, but through behavior, hesitation, over-explaining, seeking reassurance. These are not personality traits. They are signals. Signals that your authority is external, not internal. But when you begin to shift this, everything changes. You stop overcommitting. You stop explaining every decision. You stop chasing agreement. Not because you don't care, but because you trust your own judgment. And that trust creates stability. You speak less but with more certainty. You move slower but with more intention. You engage selectively, not desperately, and people feel it. Because internal authority does not fluctuate based on approval. It remains consistent, regardless of the environment. You don't need to dominate a room to be respected. You need to be grounded in yourself, because when a man respects his own time, energy, and direction, he no longer looks for permission. He operates from clarity, and clarity is powerful. It removes doubt. It removes hesitation. It removes the need to prove. And when those disappear, what remains is presence, a presence that is calm, unshaken, difficult to ignore, because authority is not something you demand. It's something you become, quietly, consistently, from within. Most people lose power, not because they lack ability, but because they care too much about the outcome. They want the approval, the response, the validation, and that desire slowly turns into dependence. You start checking for replies, waiting for reactions, adjusting your behavior based on how others respond. And without realizing it, you give control away, because the more you need something, the less control you have over it. This is the paradox most people never understand. Attachment feels like passion, but often it is pressure. And pressure is visible. People can sense when you are too invested, when you're hoping, when you're waiting, and that changes how they treat you. Because when your emotional state depends on an outcome, you are no longer stable. You become reactive, easy to influence, easy to manipulate, easy to read. Now imagine a different approach. You still act, you still engage, you still pursue, but internally, you are detached. You do what needs to be done, and then you let go. No overthinking, no waiting, no emotional dependence on the result. And suddenly, something shifts. You feel lighter, more focused, more in control. Because now, your behavior is not driven by fear of loss, but by clarity of action. Detachment is not about becoming cold. It's about becoming free, free from needing approval, free from chasing outcomes, free from emotional dependency, and that freedom creates a different kind of presence. You speak without hesitation because you're not afraid of rejection. You walk away when necessary because you're not afraid of loss. You remain calm under pressure because you're not attached to results. And people feel that immediately, because most individuals are driven by need. They chase, they wait, they react. But when you don't, you stand out, not loudly, but clearly, because you cannot be controlled by what you don't depend on. This is where real power begins. Not in forcing outcomes, but in releasing them. Because the moment you stop needing something to happen, you start operating at your Highest level. You think clearly, act intentionally, respond calmly. And ironically, that's when things begin to move in your favor. Because people are drawn to those who are not chasing them. They respect those who are not desperate for approval. They trust those who remain stable, regardless of outcomes. Detachment creates space. And in that space, your presence expands, your influence grows, your decisions sharpen. Because now, nothing owns you, not expectations, not opinions, not results. And when nothing owns you, you become very difficult to control, and anything that cannot be controlled naturally commands respect. Most people don't choose their actions. They react to them. Something happens, and they respond instantly. A message triggers emotion. A situation creates pressure. A person says something unexpected, and without thinking, they act. Fast, emotional, unfiltered. In the moment, it feels natural, even justified. But later comes regret, because emotion is immediate, but consequences are delayed. And by the time you see the result, it's already too late. This is how most people live. Not by strategy, but by impulse. They say things they didn't mean, make decisions they didn't think through, engage in situations that drain them, and over time, this pattern creates chaos. Because when your actions are driven by emotion, your direction becomes unpredictable even to yourself. Now imagine the opposite. Something happens, but instead of reacting, you pause just for a moment. You don't rush to respond. You don't let the emotion take over. You observe it. You let it pass through without immediately acting on it. And in that small gap, you gain something most people never experience. Control. Because now, you're not reacting to the situation, you're choosing your response. Strategic thinking begins with one simple habit: delaying reaction. Not forever, not unnaturally, just long enough to ask, what outcome do I want here? That question changes everything. Because now, your response is not about releasing emotion. It's about creating results. You stop trying to win arguments and start trying to control outcomes. You stop reacting to words and start analyzing intentions. You stop chasing immediate satisfaction and start thinking long-term. This is where the shift happens from emotional living to strategic thinking, and the difference is visible. Emotionally driven people are easy to read, easy to provoke, easy to predict. They move fast, but without direction. Strategic individuals are different. They move slower, but with precision. They speak less, but with purpose. They act less, but with impact, because every move is calculated, not in a manipulative way, but in a controlled way. They understand that every action has a ripple effect. Every word creates a reaction. Every decision shapes perception. So they don't act randomly. They act intentionally. This doesn't mean you stop feeling. It means you stop letting feelings control your actions. You still experience anger, frustration, excitement, but instead of reacting instantly, you channel it. You use it as information, not instruction. And over time, this builds something powerful. Clarity. Because when emotion no longer clouds your thinking, you start seeing situations for what they truly are. Not how they feel, but what they mean. And that clarity gives you an advantage most people will never have. While others are caught in reaction, you are operating with intention. While others are driven by impulse, you are guided by outcome. And in a world where most people act without thinking, the one who thinks before acting quietly takes control. One of the fastest ways to lose influence over your life is to become predictable. Because when people can predict you, they can position you. They know how you'll respond. They know what will trigger you. They know how far they can push before you react. And without realizing it, you become easy to manage. Not through force, but through familiarity. This is how most people are controlled socially, not because they are weak, but because they are consistent in the wrong way. Same reactions, same emotions, same responses over time. This creates a pattern, and once your pattern is known, your behavior becomes expected. But here's what most people don't realize. Predictability removes mystery, and without mystery, there is no tension. No curiosity, no hesitation, no respect for uncertainty. Now imagine someone who breaks that pattern. Not randomly, not chaotically, but intentionally. Sometimes they respond quickly, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they engage deeply, sometimes they stay silent. Sometimes they show emotion, sometimes they remain unreadable. And suddenly, people can't fully map them. They start paying attention. they start adjusting. They start thinking before they act around them because unpredictability creates awareness. And awareness creates caution, and caution creates power. This is not about acting strange or inconsistent for no reason. It's about removing automatic behavior. Most people operate on autopilot. Same reaction to disrespect, same response to attention, same emotional output regardless of situation. But when you break that cycle, you become harder to read. And when people can't read you, they become careful. They stop assuming. They stop testing as much. They start observing you instead, and that shifts the dynamic. Now you are no longer reacting inside their framework. They are reacting inside yours. Because unpredictability forces attention. It forces people to reassess you in real time. And in that reassessment, you gain space. Space to decide, space to observe, space to act strategically. But the key here is control. Because unpredictability without control becomes chaos. And chaos destroys respect. True power is not random behavior. It is controlled variation. You choose when to speak and when to stay silent. You choose when to engage and when to withdraw. You choose when to show emotion and when to stay still. Nothing is automatic. Everything is intentional. And that is what makes you difficult to read. Because people are comfortable around patterns. They relax when they understand someone's behavior. But when that understanding disappears, they become alert, and alertness changes behavior. They start thinking twice. They start adjusting their tone. They start measuring their actions. And slowly, you stop being just another person. In their environment, you become someone they monitor, not because you demanded attention, but because your behavior requires interpretation. And interpretation always creates depth. And depth always creates influence. Because in the end, people don't respect what they fully understand. They respect what they cannot fully control. Real control is rarely loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't seek permission to exist. Because the moment you start explaining too much, you start losing authority. Most people don't realize this. They over-explain their decisions, over-justify their actions, overshare their intentions. And in doing so, they give away their position because explanation creates openings, and openings invite questioning. Questioning invites resistance, and resistance slowly weakens influence. Now think about people who naturally command respect. They don't rush to defend themselves. They don't feel the need to prove everything. They don't over-detail their choices. They decide and move forward. Calmly, quietly, without emotional leakage, and that silence changes everything. Because silence forces interpretation. When you don't explain yourself, people begin to fill in the gaps. They start assuming. They start analyzing. They start assigning meaning to your behavior. And ironically, this gives you more control over perception than explanation ever could. Because when you explain too much, you lock your image into words. But when you stay silent, you let others construct your image for you, and they often construct it in a way that increases your authority. Not because they are wrong, but because uncertainty naturally creates depth. Now here is where the psychological shift happens. Most people believe control comes from speaking more, but in reality, control often comes from speaking less. Not silence out of fear, but silence out of strength. The ability to sit in discomfort without rushing to fill it. The ability to let misunderstandings exist temporarily without panic. The ability to stay calm when others demand immediate explanation. This creates psychological weight because people are used to instant access, instant answers, instant validation, instant clarification. So when you don't provide it, you stand apart, and that separation creates authority. Because now your actions are not constantly available for evaluation. They exist without immediate interpretation. And in that space, people begin to assign significance to you. They think more carefully about your words. They analyze your silence. They interpret your distance as meaning. And meaning creates influence. But silent control is not about ignoring everyone. It is about choosing when to speak in and when not to. Because the person who speaks only when necessary automatically gains weight in their words. They are not diluted by constant communication. Every sentence carries intention. Every response carries purpose. Every silence carries pressure. And over time, this builds a presence that feels different. Not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable. Because people begin to feel your control even when you say nothing. They sense boundaries without them being stated. They adjust behavior without being told. They become aware of your limits without you enforcing them constantly. This is the highest form of influence, not forcing compliance, but creating awareness. And awareness changes behavior naturally, because when someone understands that you don't over-explain, overreact, or over-justify, they start treating you with more caution, and caution is respect in disguise. So silent control is not absence, it is presence without noise. And in a world where everyone is trying to be heard, the one who can remain silent often becomes the most powerful voice in the room. The real war is not outside of you, it is inside, between reaction and restraint, between impulse and awareness, between what you feel and what you choose to do. Most people believe strength is about facing the world, but the truth is deeper. Strength is about facing yourself, because every moment your mind is producing signals: anger, frustration, excitement, fear, desire. And each one of these signals is asking for action. Speak now, react now, respond now, do something now. But emotional discipline begins when you learn a simple truth: not every feeling deserves a response. This is where most people lose themselves. They confuse emotion with instruction. They confuse intensity with importance. They confuse urgency with truth. And so they act quickly, without filtering, without observing, and every unfiltered action shapes their future. Words said in anger damage relationships. Decisions made in excitement create regret. Responses made in fear limit opportunities. And slowly, life becomes a reflection of uncontrolled emotion. But emotional discipline changes this entirely. It creates space between feeling and action. Not suppression, not denial, but observation. You feel the emotion, but you don't become it. You notice anger rising, but you don't let it speak. You notice fear appearing, but you don't let it decide. You notice desire pulling, but you don't let it control direction. Instead, you pause, and in that pause, power returns. Because now you are no longer a slave to internal impulses. You are the one observing them. And observation creates authority over the self. This is what most people never develop. They train their body, they train their skills, they train their knowledge, but they never train their emotional response. So they remain predictable from the inside out. But a disciplined mind is different. It does not eliminate emotion. It regulates it. It understands that emotion is energy, not direction. And energy can be used, or it can be wasted. Emotionally disciplined individuals use it. They transform anger into clarity. They transform frustration into strategy. They transform fear into awareness. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is blindly released. This is why they appear calm under pressure, not because they feel less, but because they control more. And people notice this instantly. Because in a world where most react instantly, calmness becomes a signal of strength. It communicates stability. It communicates control. It communicates depth. But emotional discipline is not built in comfort. It is built in moments of tension. When someone disrespects you, and you don't react immediately. When something goes wrong, and you don't panic. When emotions rise, and you don't let them lead. Each moment becomes training. Training your mind to respond instead of react. And over time, this builds something powerful. Self-mastery. Not domination over others, but mastery over yourself. Because once you can control what happens inside you, you stop being controlled by what happens outside you. And that changes everything. Your decisions become sharper. Your presence becomes calmer. Your influence becomes deeper. Because people can sense it. They feel when someone is not ruled by emotion. They feel when someone does not break easily. They feel when someone does not lose control. And that feeling creates distance, respect, caution, attention, and in silence, authority grows. Because emotional discipline is not just control. It is power that cannot be taken from you, only lost. When you forget it, there comes a point in life when you realize something unsettling. Most people are not in control of their lives. They are being carried by them. By emotions, by opinions, by circumstances, by reactions they never questioned. And from the outside, it looks normal. People are busy, people are talking, people are moving. But internally, they are unstable, shifting with every situation, adjusting with every opinion, breaking slightly with every setback. And this is where self-mastery begins. Not in controlling the world, but in refusing to be controlled by it. Self-mastery is the ability to remain centered, even when everything around you is not. It is not a loud transformation. It is quiet, almost invisible, but deeply powerful. Because instead of reacting to life, you begin to observe it. You stop seeing every event as personal. You stop taking every opinion as truth. You stop treating every challenge as a threat. And slowly, your perspective shifts. You are no longer inside the chaos. You are above it. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop being controlled. You still engage. You still act. You still participate in life. But you are no longer emotionally dragged by it. There is a distance now. A space between you and the world. And in that space, clarity grows because chaos thrives in emotional involvement. When you are inside emotion, everything feels urgent. When you step back, everything becomes readable, and readability creates control. Self-mastery is built in moments no one sees. When you choose not to react, when you choose not to argue, when you choose not to chase validation, each moment is a silent decision. I will not lose myself here, and that decision, repeated over time, builds a different identity, a stable one, a grounded one, a powerful one, because people cannot easily shake someone who is rooted internally. They can't manipulate someone who does not emotionally collapse under pressure. They can't easily influence someone who is not dependent on external approval, and this is why self-mastery feels different in others. They notice it without being told. In your silence, in your patience, in your restraint, they sense that you are not easily moved, and that creates natural respect, not forced, not demanded, but earned through presence. Because in a world full of reaction, stillness becomes authority. But the final truth of self-mastery is this: it is not about becoming emotionless. It is about becoming unshakable. You still feel everything, but nothing controls you. And when nothing controls you, you become free, truly free, free from approval, free from reaction, free from internal chaos. And that freedom is what most people spend their entire lives searching for, without ever realizing. It was built inside them all along. Everything leads to this final realization. Not power over others, but power over yourself. Because in the beginning, you think strength is about being noticed, being respected, being feared, being understood. But the deeper you go into life, the more you realize something different. Real strength is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not chase attention. It does not depend on validation. It simply exists, stable, centered, unshaken. And most people will never reach this state, not because they cannot, but because they never stop reacting long enough to find it. They live inside emotional noise. Every opinion matters. Every insult matters. Every situation pulls them in a different direction. And slowly, they lose themselves without realizing it. But when you begin to master yourself, something changes. You stop living from reaction and start living from awareness. You stop chasing people's approval and start respecting your own direction. You stop being emotionally available to everything and start choosing what deserves your energy. And this is where real transformation happens, because now, life no longer controls you from the outside. You are guiding yourself from the inside. And that changes how the world responds to you. People begin to sense something different. Not arrogance, not aggression, but calm authority. The kind that does not need to prove anything. You don't explain yourself as much. You don't react as fast. You don't lose yourself in emotional moments anymore. And because of that, people begin to adjust around you. Not because you demanded it, but because your presence requires it. This is the silent shift most people never understand. When you change internally, everything around you recalibrates. But the final lesson is not about controlling others. It is about no longer being controlled by fear, by emotion, by opinion, by need. Because the moment you are no longer controlled internally, you cannot be controlled externally. And that is true freedom, not escape from life, but mastery within it. You still feel, you still engage, you still experience everything fully. But nothing owns your response. Nothing dictates your identity. Nothing pulls you away from your center. And in that state, you become dangerous in a different way. Not destructive, but unshakable. A person who does not collapse under pressure. A person who does not react for validation. A person who does not lose control in chaos. And people notice this. They may not understand it, but they feel it. Because calmness in a chaotic world is rare, and rarity creates value. So the real message of this journey is simple. Master yourself first, not to dominate others, but to never be dominated by anything again. Because when you are finally in control of your inner world, the outer world loses its grip on you. And at that point, you are no longer just reacting to life, you are directing it.